do not provoke. Thus the Romans, even the cavalry, which could have ridden to seal the route of escape, marched straight for the column of smoke, so surprise was sacrificed. However engaged the raiders were in their robbery and rapine, none could miss the signs of such a force marching across a dry and arid landscape, especially the clouds of dust sent up by the horses' hooves. Frustration that had been barely disguised now came near to boiling over. Narses would not release Flavius to at least get amongst the enemy as they began to retire, waiting until they were well away from the burning homesteads of a fertile valley before initiating the chase, and that came with a parting command:
"You know where the border is, Flavius Belisaurius. The marking posts you cannot miss. Do not cross it at a peril from which your high and mighty connections will struggle to protect you."
That was maddening. Worse was the quality of the unit he led. The establishment of a numerus was set at 300 fighting men, yet there was not a unit in the imperial armies that had that as its true strength. Flavius was deficient by a full quarter of what should have been his command, and, in addition, the provision of horses, the main source of mounted effectiveness, was far from perfect. Any kind of sustained and disciplined movement was constrained by the variety and fitness of what was being ridden. Personally well mounted, nothing more than a fast canter was possible, lest he wished to find himself isolated with only a rump of support. In short, most of those Flavius led could not keep up with him. So much for high connections, he thought, recalling the barbed comment of a commander keen to remind him that support in Constantinople was no guarantee of survival in the face of failure. Such thoughts were banished as the first of the short marble pillars marking the frontier came into view. His enemies had been well enough ahead of him to get across that first, and what had been headlong flight ceased. Such raiders knew of the restrictions on Roman actions as well as those who laboured under them. Perhaps, if they had not jeered and bared their buttocks, they would not have brought on such a furious response. Flavius slowed his mount and issued a series of shouted commands to get his men into some form of order. To those observing them, far enough inside their home territory to be safe from the best-cast spear, it must have looked like a display of useless impotence, and they were vocal in their ridicule. Their loud jeers were stilled as, 100 paces from the borderline, the man who led their enemies called for the horn to be blown that initiated an advance. The shocked raiders failed to react fast enough to secure their escape. Those on horses, the leaders, who had remained mounted, fled at speed, pursued by Flavius and those of his own cavalry on horses of matching quality, some 50 in total. But most of the marauders had been on foot, and, having jogged for over a league while carrying that which they had plundered, they were now too short of wind to even scatter properly before the Romans got amongst them and slaughter ensued. Concentrating on his own quarry, Flavius was not witness to what ensued. He was riding flat out, his eye on a pair of marauders who, by their richer accoutrements, in reality decorated helmets and fine cloaks, could be the leaders of the raid. He had his reins in one hand and a spear in the other. This, as he shouted commands he was unsure would be heard, to get his subordinates to select a target and pursue it to the exclusion of anyone else. "None to live!" was his last bellowed command. A full gallop could not be maintained for long, even on a fine animal, and between his thighs Flavius could feel his horse beginning to tire. Yet, if that applied to him, it did so equally to those he was pursuing, and the gap was closing as their mounts, harder worked by the trials of the day, visibly flagged. Always proud of his ability to cast a spear, Flavius took one of the riders ahead in the middle of his back as, raising himself from his hunched position to look over his shoulder, he presented a worthwhile target.